Leftism is actually the opposite of liberalism. I felt and still feel that in order to counter leftist anti-Semitism, we needed to reteach classical liberalism, in which Zionism is a natural outgrowth.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Each new academic year provides fresh evidence of something that is recognized by most observers across the political spectrum as a disturbing reality of American higher education: the decline in respect by both students and faculty at American universities and colleges for open discourse. The 2021-2022 year that's coming to a close in the upcoming weeks has proved no exception. Sometimes it's controversial speakers that are being disinvited due to fear of protests and accusations of insensitivity to the feelings of those who might disagree. Or it can concern the attempts to fire or deplatform those who say or tweet things deemed by the intellectual fashion of the day to be beyond the pale. Some of the most recent examples at Harvard, Yale, and Georgetown universities are just more proof of how ubiquitous this trend has become. But probably even more troubling than incidents involving speakers or individual students and faculty is the more pervasive phenomenon affecting students in general. Various opinion surveys from sources like the Pew Research Institute and the Knight Foundation have shown that more Americans are curbing their speech on controversial topics out of fear of being ostracized or even attacked in the current climate, where cancel culture prevails in so many forums. At the same time, growing numbers of people think that there's nothing wrong with canceling those whose opinions they consider to be offensive. Public discourse has become a dialogue of the deaf in which we refuse to listen to each other. It's also one in which those who disagree are not merely refuted, but castigated and often shunned or silenced. Yet despite the growing chorus of those who lament this, there also seems to be a general refusal to comprehend just how illiberal the new intolerance for disagreement has become. At the same time, much of the organized Jewish community, as well as many who are considered thought and opinion leaders, don't understand that among those who should be most concerned by the collapse of classical liberal beliefs about free speech are the Jews. This is reflected in the way social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter operate. In the name of enforcing community standards that are supposed to reflect shared values, these big tech giants have ruthlessly silenced opinion and news stories that either contradict the progressive views of their owners and staff or serve to undermine liberal political goals and politicians. While condemning their opponents as purveyors of disinformation, these same companies and their press allies are spewing out plenty of it themselves. Meanwhile, the possibility that free speech might be restored on Twitter with its purchase by entrepreneur and business magnate Elon Musk is being greeted with howls of outrage from many on the left, who believe that it should only exist on the virtual public square if it conforms to their beliefs. That's even more true for those who are placed in the hothouse atmosphere of academia, where woke mobs of students and their enablers and the faculty administration are always ready to silence anyone who dares to transgress against current orthodoxies on race, gender, or liberal politics. Indeed, even citadels of institutional liberalism, like the New York Times, which has itself transitioned from being the country's paper of record to an openly progressive and partisan forum, have noticed that this isn't good for society or democracy. Part of the problem is that many people don't understand that while we often use the terms liberal and progressive interchangeably to describe one side of the right-left political divide, they have come to mean very different things. Of course, that's also true about the word liberal itself. The notion that the primary purpose of government should be to defend individual rights against the power of the state was the essence of 19th century liberalism. But in the 20th century, as liberal political movements embraced the power of government in order to achieve policy aims, Such libertarianism and suspicion of government power more often became the chief concern of those on the political right. Politicians, no matter their ideology or affiliation, tend to be for whatever increases their own power and influence. Yet that turn away from classical liberal ideas on the left has turned into an open rejection with the rise of ideologies like intersectionality and critical race theory. These notions, which embody the woke catechism, don't merely depart from liberalism, they flatly contradict it, since they categorize people by race as members of groups that are either victims or victimizers, rather than as individuals. Instead of promoting the free exchange of ideas, they are focused on anathematizing those who point out the flaws, inherent racism, and intolerance of this new faith as an act of epic gaslighting, as racist and intolerant. On college campuses, this has bred not merely anger at opposing views, but a belief that to be exposed to ideas that challenge your pre-existing assumptions is a form of violence that triggers justified fear, forcing the supposed victims of these ideas to seek shelter in safe spaces. This is the opposite of the ideals of free and open exchange of ideas that higher education was supposed to foster. But for progressives, traditional liberalism is an antiquated ideology, since it is intended to promote debate, not uniformity, with those on the outside of the new ideologies damned for their retrograde views. That explains their increasing confidence in demanding that those who disagree be fired or shut up. Rather than identifying with the plight of those being canceled, this spirit of righteous indignation causes the woke to act as if their political foes deserve to be silenced, rather than to be argued with. So while respondents are telling pollsters that they are self-censoring to avoid getting on the wrong side of Twitter mobs or cancellation, many don't understand that the consequences for democracy, a principle that progressives say is being threatened by the right, when debate is curtailed or squelched. Let's understand that there is a clear difference between cancel culture and the public pushback against woke teaching that has led to calls for ban on the use of CRT in public schools or call for curbs on the imposition of other leftist ideologies among small children. Opposition to indoctrination is not suppression of free speech, but a defense of it. Just as important are the consequences specifically for the Jewish community and Jewish students. The most obvious is the way woke attacks on Jews as beneficiaries of white privilege, as well as on Israel and Zionism as expressions of oppression, has marginalized many Jews in left-wing strongholds, especially college campuses. A new survey of Jewish millennials from the American Jewish Committee showed that a significant percentage, though still a minority, of those in the 26 to 41-year-old age group felt that the anti-Israel atmosphere on campuses and elsewhere had impacted their personal friendships, commitment to the Jewish state, or even their willingness to hide their Jewish identity. It's easy to imagine that the same will be truer for the Gen Z generation now in college. Intolerance and orthodoxy are always bad news for religious and ethnic minorities, especially those who don't currently qualify for preferred minority status, like Jews and Asians in the eyes of the woke. Yet rather than understand that this represents a fundamental challenge to Jewish security, much of the organized community, including those tasked with defending it against anti-Semitism like the Anti-Defamation League, are on the wrong side of this debate. While paying lip service to the notion that Jew hatred exists on both the left and the right, they are also supporting ideas like CRT that underpin the surge of anti-Semitism. As another academic year ends with free speech under threat everywhere, but especially on campuses, it's vital that the Jewish community stop pretending that it's possible to fight anti-Semitism without being just as prepared to combat wokeness and cancel culture, and the ideas that reinforce this illiberal plague of intolerance. And now to the interview of the week. The decline in tolerance for free speech, whether on social media, on college campuses, and the rest of the public square, is a problem that can't be ignored. The question remains, what are those of us who recognize the peril that this poses to our democracy, and specifically to the Jewish community, going to do about it? The answer lies not just in political advocacy and action against the introduction of woke indoctrination into the schools and throughout society, though that is certainly necessary, but it also requires a revival of belief in classical liberal principles that transcend contemporary political loyalties and controversies. Yet how do we sell liberal ideas about open discourse and tolerance, and even encouragement of opposing views, even those we might find personally offensive, in a society in which cancel culture reigns supreme over much of journalism as well as the arts? Is it possible to promote genuinely liberal values, ideas that are ironically now associated with the political right rather than the left, in a country where not only we are giving power to woke ideologues, but also in which the collapse of respect for classical virtues in literature and the arts, as well as politics, is not so much declining as it is disappearing? One obvious answer is to champion those values. And if existing media don't provide enough space or respect for it, the obvious answer is to start a new one that will. That's what our guest has done, and it gives us an opportunity today to discuss how these ideas about freedom of speech connect not just with how society can free itself from being enthralled to anti-democratic elements on the hard left, but also to combat the decline in respect for ideas about art that are connected to beauty rather than ideology. Karen Lehrman Bloch is editor-in-chief of White Rose magazine, a new publication dedicated to restoring classical liberalism and exhibiting innovative, soulful beauty. A former guest scholar at the Brookings Institution, the Cato Institute, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, she is the author of The Lipstick Proviso: Women, Sex, and Power in the Real World, The Inspired Home, Interiors of Deep Beauty, and Passage to Israel. Her essays and commentary have appeared in the New York Times, the New Republic, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, Tablet, and Mother Jones. She has also been an editor at the New York Times Magazine, the New Republic, and the Wilson Quarterly. Karen Lehrman Bloch, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us today. I want to start by asking you why, at a time when publications are proliferating and the economic environment for journalism can be dismal, you took the leap of imagination of founding a new one yourself, White Rose Magazine. What does White Rose stand for, and why was it necessary at this moment to take this step?
So it's a very good question because it's not been easy. So during this period, especially during COVID, during the summer of 2020, when there were riots all over the place here in New York City, and lies were abounding everywhere and on every subject, I came across a quote from Sophie Scholl, who I had known her name, but I had never really heard of before. And basically, stand up for what you believe in, even if you're standing alone. And it's kind of a quote that's sort of is who I am and throughout my career.
Right. Just explain for a minute who Sophie Scholl was.
Yeah. So that is we all should have known who she was. She was a part of this White Rose intellectual resistance group in 1942 at the University of Munich. She, her brother, and about 5 others found out, they're all Christian, found out what the Nazis were doing and tried to disseminate the truth in any way possible that they could at the time. And not surprisingly, within a year, they were, she, her brother, and 1 other were executed. But in Germany, interestingly, she is lauded as this feminist hero, and the group is far better known in Europe than in general than here. I wish I had known about it. I didn't before this. So what I wanted to do was harness their bravery, because I felt that, and I still feel this way, that a big part of why we have gotten to where we are is that the center, what I call the silent liberals, aren't speaking up. And I wanted to create a platform for them to speak up, as well as reteach classical liberalism, because what we are living through right now is not liberalism. Majid Nawaz, the Islamist head of Islam in Britain, coined the term regressive leftism in 2007 because he had denounced terrorism, and he had all these American quote unquote liberals saying, no, not terrorism is good, but, basically arguing with him. And so he's like, you're not liberal. And he coined this term regressive leftism. We've shortened it to leftism. And it's a huge confusion still, certainly on the left and somewhat on the right. But one of the things we wanted to do with the magazine is make this distinction, because leftism is actually the opposite of liberalism. And so what we're living through right now on the left is not liberalism at all. And I felt and still feel that in order to counter leftist anti-Semitism, we needed to reteach classical liberalism. So in which Zionism is a natural outgrowth. And so that's what we've tried to do. And as well, as I said, inspire bravery, inspire people to speak up despite cancel culture, despite all the reasons they're not.
Yeah, well, I think that's it's a very important point. I think, when you point out about how the summer of 2020 was to some degree a turning point for many people in this country, I think that's right on target. Now, there's lots to unpack in our examination of contemporary culture, but let's start with the whole idea of wokeness and why it is antithetical to the classical liberal values that you want White Rose to embody. Just, explain a little bit about why and how the contradiction there exists.
So classical liberalism is based on a set of principles. It's based on individualism, heterodoxy, free speech, free press, unbiased teaching. These are principles and values. From those principles and values, one can disagree. One could come to different policy conclusions. But so it's just sort of a framework for and which stems from the Enlightenment, a way of thinking up through issues and about the world and creating civil society. In stark contrast, leftism or woke culture has set down this orthodoxy of belief, thought, even who and whom to like, what movies to read, from the top all the way down to the bottom. There is a right and a wrong. So in a sense, it is a cult, and it is it tells people what to think, how to think, not to think critically, and most importantly, not to think for themselves. And so it is antithetical to basically every aspect of liberalism. And what's been interesting is that, especially in the last year, more say commentators in the center to right frame use the word leftism when describing, or woke when describing that, and not liberal. And I also wanted to be able, like I was initially told, oh, you shouldn't use classical liberal, you'll never get people to understand it, blah, blah, blah. But I wanted to be able to say, I'm a classical liberal. What you're doing is not liberal. That is not liberal. This illiberal, anti-liberal. So yes. It was so aside from the fact that I am a classical liberal, it was very important for me to maintain that, even if it worked against us at times as a magazine. So I think
that's a very important point. This is sort of a digression into the study of English literature, and we're both very interested in the arts and the roots of our political troubles being there. But there's a great passage in one of Anthony Trollope's parliamentary novels, The Duke's Children, not very well known, not taught certainly in the schools, in where one of the leading characters, who's an aristocrat and a politician in 19th century England, tries to teach his son, who's going to enter Parliament, what he's supposed to do, and he's very entitled, and he gives him the creed of liberalism, and the creed of liberalism is to defend the liberty of the ordinary citizen, to make sure that the ordinary citizen is not burdened by government, to that he can able to do business, to do what he likes, and in the end, to as this great line, he says, to make sure that he is free. That's what liberalism meant in the 1870s. Obviously in today's context, over the course of the 20th century, as sort of the progressives embrace government power, the idea that suspicion of government or restraining government power became something that, quote unquote, political conservatives or libertarians were more interested in. But here in the 21st century, this just shows how meaningless these political labels are, because to be liberal, what we often casually label as liberal, is actually not liberal at all. The disconnect between liberal values and and sort of what we call conservatism is very odd.
Well, yes, and that's why, and this is actually an interesting point. The really woke far left don't even call themselves liberal, not because they know they're not liberal, because they see that somehow as being too centrist or too
progressive politics has nothing to do with liberalism.
Right. So they call themselves progressive or whatever they call themselves. So, but yes, I refused, and now it's a little easier because I think more people understand the difference. But at the time, I just refused to give them that word. Like, you're not liberal. I'm liberal. This is, and so, and throughout most of my career, there was no problem with that. My first hint of cancel culture, and we didn't use the word leftism at the time, was when I had published my book on feminism called The Lipstick Proviso. And there was no internet yet, but when, every women's studies professor ganged up on me. And, because basically all I said was, feminism is actually a subset of liberalism. Feminism means freedom. What you're trying to sell these girls is another orthodox. And at the time I used those terms against what they were trying to teach as feminism. At that time, I didn't realize that it was going to grow to all subjects. And it had been growing, and that was 1997. And it was so ugly at that point that I left political journalism for nearly 10 years. So, because it was, not, and I wouldn't do that today. And I don't encourage leaving. I encourage standing up, but I was much younger. And so, it was, but it, as I said, it started in a few subjects, and then
it branched out. And now we're confronted, and you talk about 2020 being the turning point. Ideas like critical race theory and intersectionality have kind of gone mainstream. They started on the margins in academia, in departments like the ones that you were just describing, but now their influence is spreading. So I think what I want you to do is explain how those theories are so contradicted by classical liberalism, how they're in conflict, and why it's important for those who believe in free speech to stand up against them.
So first I'll start with how universities used to work, because I think people at this point have forgotten. I was an international relations major with a heavy emphasis on political philosophy at Penn, and not once did I know the personal political views of my professors. Not once. It was unethical. They didn't they didn't even censor themselves. It was just, it wasn't done. Today, the exact opposite is, of course, done. professors write classes based on their opinions. So much of what we're dealing with are a few professors' opinions that have gotten mainstream. The critical race theory and all of the subsidiaries, in a nutshell, goes against Martin Luther King's very classical liberal statement of he wants his children to be judged by the content of their character. We have turned society, and especially, and what's really sad is in New York City, because one of the best things about raising a child here in New York City was that at a playground, he played with everyone. He never noticed race. He never noticed religion, nothing. And it was beautiful to watch because I grew up in a suburb and it was very different. Now it's being hammered into these kids to first look at race, to first then say, well, what about you and race? To all these questions. And that's not liberalism. This is, we're going to be focusing a lot on Judean ethnicity actually at White Rose. But so I always say that at our heart, we are individuals. We are all parts of groups. But when it comes down to it, we make individuals. We're both Jewish, but we are individuals. We think differently, and it's such a bigotry of low expectations to apply this sort of race or religion or any kind of racial talk up to any group to any identity, quote unquote. But of course now everything is identity, but which is, as I said, I'm not against identity. People should find their strength in their identity and their history and their heritage, but identity is not more important than the individual's voice and soul and brain. And that is that is sort of the larger picture of what has happened here. And I see it, interestingly, so my son is 12 and so he's part of Gen Z, and interestingly, and in a positive way, right now he's in a public school, but he has friends in private school where this is being hammered into them every day. They are mocking this, and that's a positive. It could lead to a negative at some point, no one talks about this, about the fact that if you hammer something so uninstinctive into kids starting at a young age, they're going to rebel. Because it isn't instinctive to look at a person's race before anything. It's not. You as I said, you look at it at a playground here in 10 years ago, the kids it was a mosaic, a beautiful mosaic, as what civil society should be.
Yeah, these doctrines are inherently racist themselves. Indeed, the irony is that "quote unquote" anti-racism is racist, and I think your point about children, as Oscar Hammerstein wrote, I think in 1949 in South Pacific, you've got to be taught to hate.
100%, yes, and they're not being taught to hate yet. Well, in the sense they're being taught to hate whites, but just even what I hear, because you hear them talk, just this overemphasis on whether it's gender or whatever, it doesn't. And I guess this is what my hopeful sign is. I see among this generation that maybe as opposed to the millennial generation, their instincts are pure and they're not buying it. And that's what we actually created a section on the site, called Gen Z leaflets, because the original White Rose put out leaflets to disseminate about what was happening. And so we encourage, and I want to encourage any Gen Zers to write, even under a pseudonym, it's okay, because I feel, and at this point, Gen Z is about to graduate college. So they're moving up, and I think we're going to see a huge change from them, as well as hopefully more silent liberals will begin to speak up as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think, the battle for free speech is on here. And I think, as we've seen in various, instances, certainly what happened in the election in Virginia last fall seemed to indicate that there is a pushback. What's going on in Florida now in controversies about sort of indoctrination in really, kindergarten through third grade. There is a pushback. It's not a one-sided battle as it seemed to be when you started White Rose. So I guess my next question is, you're someone who identifies as the credentials as a liberal, as a feminist thinker. Why is it that ideas that are quintessentially feminist and integral to the defense of the rights of women are suddenly out of fashion and being replaced by very different rules, and that have the effect, in ideas about gender, have the effect of undermining or marginalizing women?
Very much so, and thank you for bringing that up, because it's very hard to look at, especially since a big this incident happened at Penn, where I graduated. So
you're obviously referring to Leah Thomas, who is a transgender person who was a male and now identifies as female, and because he's bigger and stronger and longer arms and legs, dominated the swimming competitions in the Ivy League and actually is an NCAA champion now. Basically undermining the rights of women and all the achievements of Title IX, which created women's sports in the name of sort of the new gender ideology.
So again, this didn't happen overnight. It happened with feminism turning into this orthodoxy, which happened with third wave feminism. Even in second wave feminism, it was still very much believed that women had choices, and it was very much based on freedom. In fact, one of the very first feminist groups exactly 100 years ago was called heterodoxy. So this whole notion of that you should vote for this Democrat because you're a woman, or you should vote for a woman because you're a woman, that too is antithetical to feminism. But all of that laid the groundwork for women being told what to do. Mm-hmm. So, we went from quote unquote feminist leaders telling us what to do to now what I, in my last piece, called the gender industrial complex, telling us what to do and telling us that, oh no, you should put all of your rights-based interests aside, because this is the most important thing happening today. And what I don't even want to make a joke about it, because it's so sad, because there are so many young teens who are being poorly influenced by teachers and even their parents. And this entire, let's leave aside, when they get to play on sports teams, they're transitioning at an incredibly young age. They're, the detransitioning process doesn't always work. There's going to be astronomical mental health issues among this segment of the population. But anyway, so to get to your point, yes, it is very much an anti-feminist crusade. There is a famous line in liberalism: "Your rights end where mine begin," and they don't seem to understand that. They don't understand that. Okay, go, dress as you want, do what you want, but when you're intruding upon my rights, that's not liberalism. And it also, as you said, goes against title. We actually have, and we have law.
It goes against federal law. It also contradicts, science. We hear a lot from people on the left about respecting science, except when it contradicts their ideology.
Right. No. And so again, it's ideology above all. But again, this was all set up by by everyone being subjugated to this orthodoxy so that we get told what to think, which is that in itself is antithetical to liberalism.
Yes. I'm really interested because one of the most important aspects of White Rose magazine is your devotion to this idea of classical beauty and its importance in our culture. Explain to us a little about how artistic fashion, which is also a function of wokeness, has undermined belief in the importance of beauty in the arts in all its varieties, and why it matters that we push back against this trend wherever we see it.
So if you'll notice in this sort of bigger picture that this revolution, this woke revolution, doesn't really have art alongside it, which is in stark contrast, for instance, to the 60s and early 70s. And that's not a coincidence because it is, so one of our major missions is to show that the principles of both liberalism and aesthetics stem from nature. That's not a coincidence. And so what they're doing is obviously against nature. But anyway, leaving that aside, the reason it's so important, other than the fact that it actually does go with the principles of liberalism, is that art that achieves the highest level, and we know what types of art are like that throughout history, and even somewhat today are being created, but not as much, nourishes our souls, our spirits. It is through music and painting and drawing and design that God touches our souls when we are not as religious, that we, not using religion as much as others. So
I think in our contemporary culture right now, politics now plays the role that religion used to play in most people's lives.
100%, yes, and so I guess the point is that in addition to reteaching the fact that one can have a heterodoxy of opinion, we in order to create a fruitful civil society, our souls need to be nourished through the arts. Also, and this is a point that I haven't made yet in writing, but I'll just throw this out there. This de-emphasis on creativity, I think, has played a really negative role in convincing creative teens to change themselves rather than create. When I was a teen, and, going through hormonal whatevers, I wrote, I read, I drew. That's what creative kids used to do. Not today. Today, it's all about remaking yourself. And it's not in the creativity. And we are creative beings. And we all create differently, but we are creative beings. We need to create. The levels of depression right now are skyrocketing. Obviously, COVID didn't help, but I also believe and I know people like this who are very creative people, but have stopped creating. They're addicted to social media. They're addicted to all sorts of things that go against creativity. And so it's a twofold. It's, first of all, we need beauty to nourish our souls. I go out to Central Park when I need to, because it's the only real beauty left in New York City in some ways. But it's also, we need to create, each of us in whatever way we can. It is part of being human to create. to create light.
Yeah, and I think it was not an accident that a lot of the sort of when we talk about 2020 and what's gone forward with that, a lot of that sort of quote unquote activism took the form of iconoclasm and of tearing things down, tearing down statues, purging museums, even. I wrote about this myself, where there was a collection of Titians finally brought together in this amazing exhibition at the Gardner Museum in Boston. It came with trigger warnings to try and with an explanation. What Zeus is doing. In these pictures, don't try it at home. And then to have a counter, it had to be countered by some contemporary art, which was basically showing someone, relieving themselves, and sort of the opposite of what Titian was trying for in terms of classical beauty. This is where it leads to. I mean, it doesn't seem to be like the same thing as some of the political issues and the free speech issues, but it all comes together, doesn't it?
It does, and right now in the public school system here in New York City, it's pulling everyone down to the same level. It's not about achieving excellence, which is what you're talking about. We are inspired by excellence, of course, but they don't understand that. They think that, or I don't even know if they think it, or they've just concocted this belief that excellence makes people feel bad about themselves. That no, it doesn't. It inspires. It inspires greatness within. One of my son's friends grew up in the projects, worked his way studiously out of them. He now goes to one of the best private schools here in the city. If you were to say to him, don't work so hard, don't aspire to excellence, he would be like, he would want to chop your head off, basically. I mean, because you talk to individuals that they know it doesn't work. It's everything they're doing, it goes against human nature. It is our nature to be the best we can be. And they're just, right now, we're going to be switching ours into private schools because this whole public school system is going to be all about, bringing everybody down to the lowest common denominator. What?
Yeah.
What is that? I mean, and I'm sorry.
Yeah, and this takes the form. I know it's a controversy in New York. It's also one in other cities, in Philadelphia, where they've abolished, advanced, merit to get into magnet schools. They've abolished, programs that help advance students, because that's considered to be counter, not for equity. And indeed, even the Biden administration has demanded every department of the government talk about equity rather than equality. So
and that is a huge distinction that most people don't understand. Equity means that we should all end up at the same place, whereas equality, which is an integral part of liberalism, is that we must, as a society, make sure that everyone's starting at the same place. So all of this attention that they're putting on bringing everything down, they could have been using to make some of the schools in, for instance, New York City better, so that it would raise everybody up. But no, because they don't understand that would be real liberalism. And as well, they're talking about equity for women. It doesn't matter how many women are in Congress. It really doesn't matter. What matters is that there is nothing stopping a woman from being elected to Congress. Whereas women weren't even allowed to go to school, over 100 years ago. But now
in Afghanistan, yes.
Yes. But also now we have this new gender complex that is also putting brakes on women's progress. How are we going to win at sports if we're playing against biological males? So it's equally repressive. They don't see it that way. But that whole, everybody should be against this word equity because equity is illiberal and it's against human nature. we're all different. I always bring up the leaves on a tree. No leaf is the same. No snowflake is the same. We are aspects of nature. We are all different. As long as society provides the ability for all of us to start at the same place, then, and also obviously not be racist in a real sense of the word, or sexist, then we all grow, we develop, we become our best selves. But we're not the same. And there was never an attempt for us to be the same in liberalism.
Right. We've talked a lot about how these negative trends in our culture and society affect society as a whole, but let's not talk how it specifically impacts Jews. How is it that Jewish groups are among those supporting woke ideology, and why don't they see that how it helps those stigmatizing Jews as well as Israel?
Yeah. So this is a very delicate, but it's becoming a non-delicate issue because when I returned to politics, I was on Facebook promoting a book on interior design, and the Hamas war of 2014 broke out, and I see none of my political liberal Jewish friends defending Israel. So I started to defend Israel in a very factual, journalistic type of way. They unfriended me. Some of them blocked me. They still don't speak to me, some of these people, for laying down facts. And so, okay, why? Because this has become very much so, and now it's actually become an even bigger part of progressive leftist woke ideology to be anti-Israel and anti-Zionist. So even though they themselves were Zionists, they couldn't publicly, even on Facebook, be friends with somebody who was outwardly Zionist. So why are they like this? Why? I think we, as you know, we have our next issue is on challenging the Jewish leadership, and because in part it's Jewish leadership that has brought us to this place, and you have an excellent piece on the ADL, but it's one of the main reasons is the whole notion of tikkun olam was mistranslated. Honestly, the bigger picture for me has always been status. My former friends were very comfortable in their positions. They saw that the trends were going toward further and further toward the left in terms of culture, and they wanted to stay in their positions. And none of this is that's, I think, one big reason for, say, conservative Jews, and maybe the Reform Jews, I don't understand at all. So I don't. They've twisted everything. So it's, but I do think, and this brings me to this other point, I think there was a big mistake made by synagogues and Jewish groups in general, let's say, starting in the 70s. I believe that, after the Holocaust, assimilation, obviously, that was a priority, and no one wanted to, they didn't want to focus on how we are different and who we really are. But starting in the 70s, and certainly when studies about our DNA started to come out 10, 15 years ago, there should have been this major switch to, hey, guess what? Judaism is not just a religion. We're a people. We are an ethnicity. We hail from the Middle East. You go take a DNA sample. It'll be the same, similar to a Sephardic Jew, Mizrahi Jew, dissimilar to, and my family, grandparents were born in Russia, dissimilar to Russians. I was always told growing up, I'm from Russia. It never felt right, but that's what my dad was scared. He was scared, and he wanted a good life for his kids. But at a certain point, and this is why we're going to be doing a lot on the Judean ethnicity movement, we should have been told more about our history and that the diaspora was a pit stop. I mean, we were moved out and but connected to Israel. If these leftist Jews had known more, would they still have been? Yeah, a lot of them would have, for sure. But I think it would have been harder. It would have been harder because when I was writing a piece for the Jewish Journal when I first came across those studies, of the DNA studies, and I was like, oh my God. And I felt strong. Again, this is why I do believe in knowing one's identity and feeling at one with one's identity. I felt stronger as a person, knowing that I am that Judaism is not just a religion. It is an ethnicity. And so they may have, when identity politics started to, let's just put it this way. I think it would have been harder for the far left, Jews or not Jews, to go to exclude Jews if we had well established 20 years ago that we are an ethnicity too. We are an identity. We came here with nothing, from persecutions, from all of if that history had been better taught in Jewish day schools and synagogues, I don't think it would be as bad as where we are now. I think now, though, I think the issue of status plays this huge role, and I mean, sadly, it's still playing a role. And I think to counter that, that is one of the reasons we're doing this. We're going to do a documentary on Judean ethnicity, and I kind of want to give these people that refuse to stand up for their heritage more reasons to stand up for their heritage. That it's not just like this, oh yeah, I'm Jewish, go to say it's no, you're part of this people, whether you like it or not. And that doesn't mean, again, that we all vote the same, that we all think the same, but we are part of a people with an excruciating past. I just did a review on this new movie, The Survivor, which is going to be like the new Schindler's List, and it's incredibly well done. And I'm not going to say more. It's a Holocaust film. Anyway, we have an excruciating past that never gets talked about, of course, as you know, in all these ethnic studies curriculum. The fact that there are ethnic studies curriculum that don't mention Jews or mention us as part of whites who have privilege, it's two things that are complete lies. But can I completely blame them when our synagogues 20 years ago weren't teaching this? That when enough time had passed after the Holocaust, this wasn't ingrained in every Jewish child. And I make a point of saying that it's far worse in the Ashkenazi world. In the Sephardic world, they're full of pride of who they are and where they come from. I hang out at the Safra Center here all the time, and it is such a different feel than my synagogue, and it's because it's about warmth and pride, and I feel much more connected to Israel when I'm there than when I'm at my synagogue. And this is one underlying factor that I'm hoping to change with White Rose, because obviously there's the leadership issues that we go into in the next issue. But if Jews themselves don't fully understand who they are, we're not going to get anywhere. We're going to continue to let people tell a story about us instead of us being able to stand up proudly and tell our story.
Yeah, I think that's you're really onto something there, because of course what critical race theory and ideas about white privilege does is to categorize Jews as beneficiaries of white privilege, and Israel as an expression of white privilege. Now, of course, this makes no sense because the majority of Israeli Jews are Mizrahi, and by the definitions of the progressive lexicon, people of color. So that makes no sense. But it also is, in this idea of intersectionality, which lumps all so-called oppressed peoples together, in one thing, and all oppressors together as in another thing, and Jews are among the oppressors because they're considered white, is that it denies the idea of Jewish identity, of Jewish peoplehood. It denies the idea that Jews are indigenous to the Jewish homeland, to Israel, and indeed. You speak of being in New York. I mean, one of the rabbis at Temple Bethel, Temple Emmanuel, excuse me, the oldest and most prestigious synagogues in New York, was saying, well, Jews are not an indigenous people, and I was like, and it's just this, it's an idea of Jewish identity that is essentially deracinated, of just taking Judaism has always combined universal ideas and particularist ideas. And in this, as you say, tikkun olam version of Judaism, the universalist overwhelms everything else. I mean, Cynthia Ozick famously said that for many Jews, particularism is, that universalism is the particularism of the Jews. And that's in a sense, it's a caricature, but it has come to define what even what mainstream liberal American, what is considered liberal, but which we both know is not really liberal, American Jewish culture to be.
Right. Yeah, correct. There's the aspect first. Yes, we hail from Judeans. We are Judeans. We hail from Judea. B, we came here, and I titled my last piece in Jewish Journal, we came here with nothing. We came here, all of our families, most of our families from wherever. That I was part of a Sephardic Film Festival, was an amazing documentary on Eli Tahari, and how he literally came to New York with $60 in his pocket, slept on benches in Central Park. Nobody tells those stories. We came here, but my family came here with nothing, all four grandparents. And yes, but because this is the other part that they don't want to talk about, or they don't know. I don't know. At this point, it's hard to tell. We worked hard. Working hard is part of our culture because almost we had to. And I don't want to get into even anything else about it, why we worked hard, but we had to. We've been persecuted for thousands of years, so we had to work hard and be creative in how we would survive. And so A, B, and then C. So we did A. This the whole phrase Jewish privilege is an oxymoron. There's yeah, if there are successful Jews today, and there are many, that's from working hard, or their parents worked hard, or their grandparents worked. Somebody in their family worked hard, and that's not privilege. And they also forget again because so much of this is not known that even into the 60s there were country clubs or wherever there's a no Jews allowed, where there was discrimination against us 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And yet Jewish privilege, and everybody's buying it, even the Jews, because they don't know their own history. So one of the things we really hope to do with this film is teach something that should have been taught 40 years ago. And especially, when these DNA studies came out about 20 years ago. So yes, it's all you could say it's humorous, but it's not, because of course we know of privilege walk. Kids are made to do privilege walks, whatever. And, and as I always say, yes, some of us pass as white, but did passing as white prevent the Holocaust? Did it prevent pogroms? Did it prevent, no. Because we're Jews.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and it's a very sort of ahistorical, this classification of Jews. I mean, in societies when Jews are considered white, or in some ways privileged, when in fact throughout American history Jews were not considered in that way. And I guess sort of part of your mission at White Rose seems to be sort of a general pushback. We began talking about classical liberalism, and now you're talking about sort of promoting the idea of Jewish peoplehood, which you're calling Judean identity. But the point being that what our culture is sort of doing to this one segment of the population is to strip them of their identity and strip them
It's
of
an
their
erasure.
values.
It's an erasure. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes, they're trying to erase us. I mean, especially certain segments completely. Erase our history, oh, the Holocaust was just white on white crime. I mean, who in the world could even concoct that sentence? I mean, or would have the ability, or would have the to feel that they could even say that out loud.
Mhm.
It's still astonishing.
Yeah.
Barry Levinson, the director of this new film Survivor, pointed out at the screening that 40% of college students don't know about the Holocaust. How's that possible? My son learned about it. This is one thing for the New York City public schools. He learned about it in 4th grade, and of course through synagogue and me. But here they do. How is it that in parts of the country the kids are not learning about the Holocaust? If 40% get to college and don't know about the Holocaust, so there's so many problems, and so one could actually look at all the Jewish leaders and say, okay, it's all your fault. And we kind of do in the next issue. But it's also the fault of each of us to really find out more about research and find out more about our history. And we're going to try to provide, we do have actually a section on the site called Judean Ethnicity. And we have a series of articles already. But it's incumbent upon each of us to know our history, to internalize it, and to teach it to our children. And if we had done this 40 years ago, say, I'm not saying that none of this woke stuff against Jews wouldn't exist, but it would have been much harder for them to make these outrageous statements and lies if we were able to say, excuse me, actually, but you had all these millennials who were like, oh, okay. And
yeah, basically going along with it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, from my son's birth, I've called him a Maccabee. I wanted him to connect immediately to Israel from birth. And we actually will be doing a few children's books at different levels. This is essential. And so just as much as fighting, that no anti-Semites get into Congress like now, but this is equally important because it gives Jews a reason to listen to us, to listen and say, no, you can't go along with this. But also to, again, in a sense, to internalize it to such a degree that they wouldn't even want to. They would feel such pride in who they are. They don't feel pride. They whatever they felt before woke has diminished. They're almost ashamed.
Yeah, it's deracinated Jewish identity, and I think certainly your mission is to try to correct that. Karen, we want to thank you so much for coming on and telling us about White Rose Magazine, why we need it in these trying times, and all the good work you're doing there. We also want to thank our audience, whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us on Facebook, the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV. Please like and or subscribe to Top Story and give us good reviews. Please let us know where you listen and watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.